In this lecture, we're going to be discussing deontology, or duty-based theories of ethics. The most famous deontological theory in normative ethics was championed by Immanuel Kant. The idea behind a deontological approach to ethics is to make, at least initially, a distinction between what we might think of as the right and the good. Whereas consequentialism, as we've looked at previously, focuses on the notion of the good and tries to derive a theory of what's right and wrong from understanding what's good, deontology focuses on the notion of what's right. You can sort of think of these two theories as distinguished over how they answer the question, which thing is more central, the good or the right? On a deontological approach to ethics, the right is fundamental. That is, what things are right and wrong are fundamental, and what things are good or bad are subject to understanding what's right and what's wrong. While it does seem like some actions may lead to good consequences, if those actions aren't morally right, then ultimately the theory of deontology says that they are not ultimately good. You can think of cases where somebody, steals something, a thief, or takes something in war. These are kinds of cases in which somebody has taken something that is good for them, but they have done so in the wrong way. And so ultimately, on the theory of deontology, what they have done is wrong and bad, even if the consequence for them is in some way seems good. What then is rightness, or what is the right on a deontological approach? Well, there's lots of answers, and it gets kind of complicated. One thing that's worth recognizing, though, is that what's right is just not determined by what's good. It's the other way around. One example of a more duty-based approach to ethics that we've already seen is something like divine command theory. On divine command theory, the right is determined by God's will. So God commands something, that makes it right to do or wrong to do, and everything kind of follows from what God determines. A more common theory of what is the right in a deontological approach nowadays is what we might call natural rights theory. On natural rights theory, human beings, and maybe even other living creatures, have natural rights, sometimes said, for theists, God-given rights. But even if God doesn't exist, the theory still holds up. Some people think, okay, human beings exist and they have natural rights, and these rights determine the duties that they have to one another and that others have towards us. So, for example, we normally think of parents as naturally having duties to their children, and these duties are a form of special obligation that a parent has to their own child, but not to anyone else's child, right? It's not like if you bring home a baby that somehow your neighbor is, obligated to make sure that that baby gets fed. Um, Special obligations are usually also a form of what we might think of as particular obligations. They focus on particular individuals. So, for example, students have a certain kind of general obligation to teach their professors with respect. This is a general obligation that all of you as students have. And on the basis of this general obligation that you have, we can derive a specific obligation that you have towards me, because I am your particular professor for this class. This works in the reverse as well. I have taken on a special obligation to teach each and every one of you by taking on the general obligations that come with taking on the job of being the instructor of the class. I am obligated specifically to each and every one of you on the basis of the general obligation that I assumed when I took the job. Now, through these kinds of examples, we can distinguish different kinds of obligations, right? So there are obligations that can be distinguished by their scope. General obligations are scopes that are had more towards a big group of people, towards everyone. So, for example, a general obligation that all of us have is the duty to not harm others unnecessarily. And then there are particular obligations that people can take on, right? So you might take a particular obligation on when you decide to take care of your grandmother because she's ill. That would be a particular obligation that you have towards your ill grandmother. We might also distinguish different kinds of obligation by their origin. Natural obligations are the kinds of obligations that we tend to think people have in a natural way. So by virtue of having a child and bringing it home, you seem naturally to have gained the obligation to take care of that child because it needs taken care of in order to grow up. But there are also special obligations that you can take on, and these are obligations that you have to take on in a special way. So for example, the duty that you have towards to do what your boss tells you to do, that's a special obligation given the fact that you agreed to take the job in the first place. Deontological theory deals with rights and obligations most fundamentally. So rights are related to obligations kind of in an asymmetrical or a symmetrical way, right? So generally, if someone has a right to bodily integrity or to not being harmed, then other people have an obligation towards them. Similarly, if you have a right to life, that means that other people have an obligation to not take your life. If you have a right to freedom, then other people have an obligation to not impinge on your freedom. If you have a right to property, then other people have an obligation to not take your property. This brings us to one of the most famous philosophers in the modern period, Immanuel Kant. Kant is famous for both his metaphysical theoretical philosophy as well as his ethical philosophy. And here we're going to look at Kant's ethics. Kant was a very deep thinker, and he ultimately accepted the deontological approach to ethics because he thought that he could determine or figure out how ethics ought to work and come up with a good ethical theory on the mere basis of understanding what it is to have an obligation or be duty bound to do something. He thought that if we could figure out what a duty is and what it is to have a duty, then we can figure out what duties we actually have, and thereby figure out what moral requirements we must obey and sort of follow. This way of thinking was rather revolutionary because basically Kant is saying that merely by thinking deeply about our concept of what a duty is, we can determine what we need to do in order to be morally good people. So what is it that Kant thought about duties and obligations? Well, first, Kant wants to say that duties and obligations are what we might call a species of practical requirements. Practical requirements is the larger genus category, and specific, duties and obligations are species of practical requirements. All practical requirements have a particular structure. They come like this. The requirement is it's like a rule that you have to live by in a way, right? In order to achieve something X, you first must do Y, where the achievement is something that you're aiming at, some end that you have, some goal that you're trying to achieve, and the thing that you have to do first is what we call the means. So in order to achieve some end, you must first take or undergo the means to that end. Ends are ultimately the goals or the desires or the things that are worth doing or promoting that we're trying to fully achieve. And ends are the kinds of things that Kant thinks of as having authority over you. When you are attempting to achieve an end, that means that you have to do some means. You have to take some means. The means in a practical requirement are the actions or the intermediary steps or the necessary preconditions that must be met before you can achieve your end or your goal. Here are some examples of practical requirements. In order to be fit, one must exercise, eat right, and get enough sleep. The end or goal is to be fit, and the means are exercising, eating right, and getting enough sleep. In order to get an A in this class, you must do your homework, show up to lecture, and study. In order to become President of the United States, you must receive 270 electoral college votes. Each of these things basically, it sets forth a goal or an end or something to do, to be promoted, to be achieved, and the means that one must take in order to achieve that goal. Now, there are two initial kinds of practical requirement that we might think of: desire-based practical requirements and institution-based practical requirements. And we can think of these different kinds of requirements on the basis of, or we can distinguish them by thinking of how you can escape these requirements. So requirements are things that you have to do, but there are ways out of requirements, and the ways out help distinguish the different kinds of requirements that you can be subject to, the different kinds of authority that these requirements can have over you. Take, for example, the desire-based requirement that in order to play football in the NFL, you need to practice every day, probably from the time that you're in high school through college all the way to the NFL. But there's a way that one can escape this requirement. It's not like everyone has to practice football every single day. And the way to escape the requirement is to give up the desire to play football in the NFL. If you want to play football in the NFL, you do need to practice every day. But if you don't, or you never wanted to play football in the NFL, then this practical requirement simply does not apply to you. It has no authority over you, and you can escape it simply by not having the desire. There are also institution-based requirements, like as a member of Congress, one must show up to Washington, D.C. when the House and Senate are in session. For these kinds of requirements, in order to escape the requirement, it's not the same as losing the desire, right? It's not like if you're a member of Congress, you can just stop wanting to be a member of Congress, and then all of a sudden you don't have to show up. You have to actually quit or just never become a congressperson in the first place. You have to actually get outside of the institution for the institutional requirements to no longer apply to you. This is similar to, you are a student in this class. Suppose, you don't care about passing this class anymore. Well, you still have to, do all the homework and the writing requirements and the take all the quizzes. But you can also just drop the class, right? If you drop the class, then the requirements no longer apply to you. Now, what about morality? Morality seems to be the kind of thing that requires that you act practically in certain ways. But what kind of a practical requirement is a moral requirement? A requirement that says like that you shouldn't murder people or that you shouldn't, steal things. Is that the kind of requirement that's based on your desires or based on some institution? While certainly, certain immoral things are unlawful, that doesn't necessarily mean that the morality itself is based on an institution. And it's not the case that you shouldn't murder people just because you don't want to. It seems like it's got to be more than that. Now, for Kant, one of the hallmarks of a real moral requirement is that it has universality, which means that it applies to everyone, no matter what. You can know that a certain practical requirement is universal if it's inescapable. That means that it's not possible to actually escape that requirement without, dying or giving up whatever life that you have. An inescapable requirement is one that always applies to everyone, or at least always applies. And no matter what your desires are, or the institutions that you apply to or that you are part of, moral requirements always seem to apply. It's never the case that it's all right to murder someone, and it's never the case that it's all right to steal something, or according to Kant, it's never morally acceptable to lie. Kant also thinks that moral requirements are unconditional. That is, there's not some condition that one must meet in order for them to apply. And so this leads Kant to make a distinction between what we might call categorical requirements, unconditional requirements, and hypothetical requirements, or requirements that do actually have a condition. Categorical requirements, or categorical imperatives, as Kant likes to call them, are a different kind of practical requirement. They apply categorically or unconditionally, meaning that they apply always, and they always have authority over you. They have what Kant calls a categorical structure. Categorical imperatives are the kinds of commands that tell you to do particular things or not do particular things, but they don't have relevant aims, goals, or conditions that one is trying to meet in the command, right? So instead of it being like, well, if you want to do X, then you should do Y. No, instead it just says, do action X. Doesn't give you some reason or aim or goal to justify. Hypothetical imperatives, on the other hand, are the kind of practical requirements that we were looking at earlier, right? So things like desire-based requirements. If you want to X, then you must Y, right? If you want to be healthy, then you need to eat salads instead of pizza, right? And institution-based, right? So if you are a student, then you must enroll in classes, something like that, where you take certain goals or ends and there are means to achieving those goals or ends. Hypothetical imperatives are distinct from categorical imperatives because they have these conditions, these if parts. So now then we can distinguish between three different kinds of practical requirement, two kinds of hypothetical requirement, one's based on desires, another based on institutions, and then finally categorical requirements, or requirements that apply always and to everyone, no matter what. Now, what exactly does it mean to say that a categorical requirement or categorical imperative applies unconditionally? What does it mean to say that it applies to everyone? Well, according to Kant, categorical imperatives carry their authority with them. That is, they're in a way, the authority of the imperative is internal to the requirement itself. They don't need the if clause at all. There's no condition that applies that one must meet in order for the categorical imperative to apply itself. This becomes more clear if we first look at hypothetical imperatives. So hypothetical imperatives or hypothetical requirements begin with a condition that must be met. They give you a reason, a hypothetical condition that you have to meet or do for them to tell you what to do, right? So otherwise, hypothetical imperatives lack a kind of authority, right? So suppose you want some six-pack abs, well then you need to put down the pizza, right? So it's this hypothetical requirement of something that you might want and what you need to do in order to achieve that thing. Categorical requirements or imperatives, they just tell you what to do. They are prescriptive statements that don't come with any condition in order for them to apply. It's not like, if you want to, don't harm or murder anyone. No, it's just don't harm or murder anyone, right? It's not as if you need to only treat people with respect if, they are in an authority figure or have some status. No, you should always treat people with respect. These kinds of imperatives are the kinds of things that are, don't need a condition in order to apply. Now you might think, wait a minute, do all imperatives really need a condition to apply? Like maybe even categorical imperatives, like moral imperatives, um, you know, there has to be some condition that they meet, right? Like I can imagine a scenario in which it's not wrong to harm someone because they're doing something bad, right? If they're gonna harm me, then I have the right uh, to defend myself. And so the imperative don't harm other people only, it comes with the if clause that says basically if they're not trying to hurt you, then don't harm other people. So is it really true that categorical imperatives must lack conditions under which they apply? That is, that they always apply, they apply unconditionally. Well, for Kant, truly categorical imperatives must lack all conditions. That means they must be unconditional. Truly categorical imperatives are super basic, and so basic that they must be unconditional and inescapable. Take, for example, this most general and obvious of all rules of action. It's the rule that says you should do the things that you have reasons to do, right? Only do things when you have reasons to do them. Are there any conditions that you could put on this rule of action, on this imperative? Like, could you say, well, only in this scenario should you do things that you have reason to do? Or only under this institution should you do things that you have reason to do? No, putting conditions on this isn't going to change anything. The rule that just tells you that the things that you should do or the things that you have reasons to do is so basic and so general, it's so universal, it's unconditional and inescapable. Another similar rule is just the rule that says be rational. This is an imperative that tells you to do something. It tells you a way to be rational. And really all that means is do what you have most reason to do, right? Don't do things that you don't have reason to do. Don't do things that are against the reasons that you have. But can you even imagine a situation in which this would be qualified? Is it not, is it as if like you should only be a rational person when you want to be a rational person, or you should only be a rational person when, you're a part of some rational group like being a college student or something like that? No, like that kind of condition doesn't even make sense. It would never apply. Like it applies, sure, but being rational is something that you should always do anyway, just because it's part of who you are as a rational creature. Ultimately, Kant thinks being rational and being moral kind of come to basically the same thing. He thinks that commands like be rational, which just are things that we have to follow them. They don't really, there's no conditions that have to be met for them to be things that we do. And don't murder have similar what we might call inescapable force. These are imperatives that apply unconditionally. That means that you don't have to meet some condition in order for them to apply to you. Now, what exactly is it to be rational anyway? Well, to be rational is to act for the reasons that you have. But can you ever act in a way that's not based on reasons or based on no reasons that you have? Sure, that's when people are irrational, when they act against the reasons that they have. But you want to be rational, right? Nobody wants to be irrational. So do you really have a choice? Can you want to be irrational? Well, that would be kind of impossible in a way, because if you want to be irrational and then you act irrationally on the basis of wanting to be irrational, then you would have a reason to be irrational. So you would rationally be acting in an irrational way. Well, that's confusing and in a way self-undermining, because you can't rationally be irrational. All of this is tied up in the fact that ultimately, at least according to Kant's thinking, we are rational creatures. Our underlying nature is such that we are creatures that think and are able to reason, and using our reasoning can come up with reasons for acting in specific ways. Because we're the kinds of creatures that have reasons and act on reasons, we can't escape that part of our nature. Being rational is part of who we are. And because of that, because it's part of who we are, there are ultimately some reasons that flow from the fact that we are the way that we are and don't have conditions on them. These reasons spring forth from our very nature as a rational being. Because I am rational, there are certain things that I have to do, like being rational. And Kant thinks the same kind of thing goes for morality. Because I'm a moral creature, there are certain things that I just have to do, namely follow the categorical imperative. Here's another way of thinking about this sort of issue. It sort of builds on a puzzle. Suppose that you believe in the divine command theory, the theory that we talked about previously, that right and wrong is determined by God and God's will alone. So that means if you're a divine command theorist, you think that the reason that you should do certain things, that certain things are moral, is because God tells you to. So if you should do X, Y, and Z, it's because God tells you to do them. But who tells you that you should do what God tells you to do? That is, what's the underlying reason that you think you have to listen to what God has to say? Now, it can't be, because it would be self-undermining, that God tells you to listen and obey what God tells you to do in the first place, right? Because that's the whole point here. God's authority is in question. If God tells you that you should do what God tells you to do, well, then what reason do you have to listen to God in the first place? What reason is there in the first place for doing what God commands? The issue here is ultimately that divine command theory rests on what we might call a hypothetical imperative. The hypothetical imperative is the assumption that you are subject to God's authority already. And if you are subject to God's authority, then you must do what God tells you to do. But you can always ask the question, why? Why am I subject to this authority? And sometimes you can actually escape that authority, right? So if you ask the question like, why do I have to, eat well in order to be healthy? Well, you can always escape that authority by deciding that you don't want to be healthy anymore. You can always ask why, and then you can always question the authority when it comes to hypothetical imperatives. When it comes to categorical imperatives, though, the fact that they're unconditional and inescapable means that they have their own internal authority. And these are the kinds of things where it just doesn't even make sense to ask why anymore, because these are the things that are just to be done. So if I tell you to go out and be rational in the world, and you ask me why, there's no sense to be made of an answer for being rational. The closest thing is, well, that's just because it's the kind of creature that you are. You're a rational creature. Kant thinks the same thing for morality. Why should you be moral? Well, there's no reason for it. It's just because you're the kind of creature that is subject to morality. Kant gives a couple of formulations of what he calls the categorical imperative, which is ultimately what he thinks of as the central rule of morality. First, he gives this version that we call the universal law formulation. It's a little bit more complicated, and I'm not going to expect you to sort of memorize it or anything. There's an easier one, but I'll first sort of explain it. The formula of universal law as a rule of morality states that you should act on the maxim that you can at the same time will to be a universal law. Basically, Kant here is saying that what you should do when it comes to trying to act morally is you should only act in ways or on rules that you can imagine everyone undertaking. So in a way, it's like the old adage, like, if your friends jumped off of a bridge, would you do it too, right? Imagine when you are acting in a particular way, if you can imagine everyone acting that way, would things be good? Would they work out well? And the question then becomes, if yes, then great. You've got something that Kant thinks you can imagine as a universal law. It's something that everyone could act on and do. If it is a universal law, then great. It's something that's moral to do and something that's acceptable. However, if everyone were to do it, if something would go wrong and things wouldn't work out very well, then it means that you probably shouldn't do it. Imagine like the case of lying. Should you ever lie? Well, in certain situations, like if everyone were to lie, would anyone ever believe anything that everyone said? Of course not. And that's ultimately a reason to not lie. The more intuitive formulation that is easier for people to grasp, I think, of Kant's notion of the categorical imperative is what he calls the formula of humanity. The formula of humanity, basically, this is a rule for morality, and it says that you should act in such a way as to treat humanity in yourself and in others always as an end and never merely as a means. Now, what exactly does that mean? What you should do, according to this formula, is that you should treat people that have ends and goals and desires. That's what Kant means by humanity. Wherever you see it, both sort of yourself, you've got to treat yourself well, and you've got to treat other people well. But you should always treat humanity as an end and never merely as a means. Now, what does that mean? It means that you should treat humanity as something that's valuable and worthy of promoting it and worthy of taking it seriously, rather than using it as a means, a mere tool to get your own ends, to your own desires. The thought here basically being that what you should do is you should value other people as valuable, and you should thereby treat them as valuable as they are. You should treat them in a way that takes their rational livelihood seriously, their ability to think and decide what they're going to do. And you should never treat someone that has a rational capacity as less than rational, as a mere tool to getting what you want. Another way of saying it is you should never treat yourself as somehow better than anyone else. A nice example of this formulation of the categorical imperative is how Kant can argue against slavery. Think about slavery. If you enslave someone, what are you doing? You're treating them and their ends as a mere means to your own ends. So if you enslave someone, you're not taking seriously what they want, what they need, how they want to live their life. You've enslaved them. You've basically made their goals subject to your will. What you want to do becomes the thing that you can use them to achieve, and you don't have to take their ends seriously. This is, of course, the opposite of what happens when we have regular jobs these days. In a regular job, of course, your boss uses you to accomplish some goal, but your boss takes your ends into account as well by paying you, right? By giving you the means to achieve the other things that you want to do in your life. So slavery is ultimately wrong on Kant's view because whenever someone is enslaved, they are being treated as a mere means to someone else's ends. And we must treat humanity always as an end in itself, according to Kant, never as a mere means. The final way of thinking about it, then, is that we should treat things that are of particular value, particularly things like human beings that have rational capacities and are obviously valuable in a certain way, and we should respect that value. We should treat a valuable thing as valuable as it is, as valuable as it deserves. Give it the respect it deserves because of the value that it has. And to not respect something that is valuable is to mistreat that thing and to wrong it, ultimately. And so finally, on Kant's view of morality, we can derive the rights and duties that we have towards each other from the basic idea of a right or duty, because ultimately certain rights and duties are found in the categorical imperatives that are grounded in our rational nature and moral nature as human beings. Because we are the way that we are, that gives us the value that we have and each other, and ultimately grounds the rights that we have against each other and the duties that we have to each other.